Today's episode of RBR is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to help easily expand your online presence through websites and much more. Welcome back to RBR, guys, and finally, the missing link to our Porsche story at Remove Before Race is the Macan. So we've covered every other car from the new 992, the Cayenne coupe, the Panamera, and some of the GT product as well, but a glaring omission has been one of the best-selling Porsches in all history, and of course that is the Macan. It has been facelifted since its debut in 2014, and today we're looking at the facelift version of the most powerful Macan, and that is the Macan Turbo. So guys, a quick note on the Remove Before Race website, which is coming soon thanks to Squarespace, who have sponsored this episode as well. We're making some really good progress on the website design, and I've found Squarespace a super easy but powerful platform to create your website and create a really strong online presence. For RBR, it was so important to get the look and feel just like what you're used to on the channel, and as you can see here, it's really easy to do with the tools inside. You don't need to have any coding background. It's just a really simple UI to work with. Nice treat for you guys is you get 10% off your first website or domain purchase using our code Remove Before Race or the link down below. I can't wait to show you the finished RBR website and our merchandise store, which will also be on Squarespace. So support our sponsors and back to the episode. So guys, as covered thoroughly in my Cayenne coupe video, the history of the Porsche SUV is a great tale about how one car single-handedly saved the automaker that we all love so much. And it was a car that Porsche had never built before either. It was an SUV. This car was the brainchild of the then new CEO Wendelin Wiedeking, who came in and completely changed the production method at Zuffenhausen by bringing in the Japanese, promoting things like part sharing between models, such as the new 996 and the then baby 911, later known as the Boxster. Speaking of which, that was another car with massively high sales figures. And these two cars together, both the Cayenne and the Boxster, helped Porsche survive a very traumatic time for that company and a time of great change. But it also then allowed Porsche to this day to continue with passion projects like 911 and the GT series. Now, the real genius step was taking factors from both of those cars and merging it into one new niche. And that was taking the small and agile and cheaper factors from the Boxster and then the practicality that Porsche customers love so much in the Cayenne and merging it all into one new car concept that was then known as the Cajun. It meant Cayenne Junior, so a smaller Porsche SUV. This was of course later named to Macan, which of course means tiger. Now, this Cajun platform, later to be the Macan, was based on the Audi Q5 platform. Now, obviously there was a lot of fear going into this from potential customers and fans of Porsche that is it just going to be a tarted up Q5? But we know today that everything Porsche has ever taken from VAR Group and turned into their own has truly been their own. But you can understand the fear that people had back then. But of course, when Porsche took that base, they completely revamped it, from the engine, the suspension, the gearbox, a unique interior, a completely unique exterior, that clamshell bonnet making it look very sports car-like. Of course, it was wider and longer than the Q5 as well. And of course, when people got their hands on the car, they saw that it actually handled fantastically, which no one expected, because frankly speaking, SUVs of that time really didn't handle like that. And that's including the RSQ3 that had just come out at that time as the first car of this kind of niche, I suppose. So the Macan immediately established itself as the Porsche of its class. Now, this was the first model that they released initially, and it was such an enticing car for us petrol heads. Even I ended up getting one of the first ones. It was exactly like this, a black car. I absolutely love the multi-spoke wheels and the front fascia being so aggressive. And the sales, just as Porsche wanted, have of course gone through the roof. Since 2018, they've sold more Macans than they have between 911, Cayman and Boxster all put together. That's a crazy number of cars. After that came the Macan facelift, and this is what we're looking at today, the Macan Turbo, so the most powerful version. It came a little bit after both the standard car, which comes with, of course, less horsepower, a different trim level on the outside, the Macan S, which is that much closer to the Turbo and something that we will discuss on the drive, and today's Macan Turbo. Now, the engine is different to that previous Macan Turbo. Now we've got a 2.9 litre bi-turbo with a hot V setup. You will note this engine is shared with great cars like the RS4 and the RS5 in Audi's lineup, but of course, Porsche's version has got specific development from Porsche themselves, and we're going to see how this hot V setup engine reacts when we go out. It's got 439 brake horsepower, so horsepower is up from the previous version as well. It's going to be no slouch. Now, there are quite a few visual differences from the previous car to this one, particularly on the direct front and rear. When you look at the previous Macan Turbo, you will note that you have quite a larger front end in terms of the intakes with those two lights coming in. It's quite an aggressive looking front, and I actually kind of prefer that one, which I had in the original car that I owned as well. But with this front end, you'll notice it's a bit softer. The overhang is less. Pretty much the entirety of the fascia is different, particularly near the LED strip on both sides under the lights. And then you've got this extra black section here, which is of course an intake that did not exist on the previous car. All in all, I think it makes this particular car look more like the 992 and the Cayman from a dead-on straight view. But of course, the rear has changed quite a lot versus the Macan. Now, of course, the biggest difference on the rear are the lights. Now, you see you've got a long strip as opposed to the previous version, which had two separate lights, both still using the idea of a 3D light structure, which is awesome and looks really good on both. But now this car has Porsche ingrained within it, just like the 992, just like the Cayenne coupe. So bringing this car more in line with those cars. Of course, you've still got a fairly aggressive diffuser, massive round black pipes on the rear. And another difference, you've got quite an aggressive spoiler on the rear of this car as well, which I think really suits the look of the Macan. You'll note this car also has carbon ceramic brakes. You can tell that from the yellow brakes rather than the white ones. They're not entirely necessary, and the standard steels now get a tungsten covering on them to stop 90% of brake wear as well as just better performance. So I would stick with the normal ones despite how good these are. There are some new wheel options as well, but apart from that, generally on the outside, it's pretty much as it was before, which is great because it's, frankly speaking, one of the best looking cars of its class. Now, what class that is kind of confuses me because it sits perhaps in between something like the RSQ3 and the GLC 63S. It's not a direct rival to either car, and we're going to explore that element of where this Macan Turbo sits in terms of its rivals when we go out on the drive as well. Now, as nice as this car is designed, and it is one of the best looking SUVs on the road, I think the Cayenne Coupe gives it a massive run for its money. Its elder brother is an amazing looking car, plus it's got that wonderful V8, such good handling as well. But just in terms of the looks, I really like that Cayenne Coupe, as you guys know from my review. Though when you look at the Macan, it is still very much kind of a raised 911, which is nice because that's kind of what you want every Porsche to link back to. It's got to link back to 911 every single time, right? And the side profile of this, very nice. Now, in terms of the future, we heard that the next generation of Macan will end up being all electric, just like the Taycan. Though I think it would end up probably looking something like this, and I want to see Porsche reduce the weight of the next generation Macan versus this one because it is quite heavy. Again, something that we're going to discuss on the drive. And I also still want to see a petrol version. Porsche have reaffirmed their love of the petrol engine, that Porsche will always have combustion engines in their lineup, particularly with the 911, but I hope that makes its way back into the next generation Macan as well. Now we have to have a look inside because although this car originally debuted in 2014, in my eyes it is still the class leader for both the class below it and above it in terms of interior refinement. I really love the interior of the Porsche Macan, and there's one real reason that I feel that way is if you spend enough money on it, it can be as luxurious and well trimmed and have as good materials as any of the flagship Porsches, be it Panamera 911 or whatever. And yes, you have to spend money to get it that way, but at least you have the option. And that is a massive difference and what separates Porsche from, say, the other German manufacturers, where in the lower echelon of cars, say, if we looked at a BMW X2 or X3 or a Mercedes GLC, you would never be able to make those cars look like their higher end version brother and sisters, even if you wanted to spend the money to do it, because Mercedes or BMW or Audi simply don't offer that level of trim for those cars because they want to upsell you to the higher cars. Whereas we look at this Macan Turbo interior, we've got Alcantara, every part of the car is covered with Napa leather. There's hardly any black plastic around, and when it is, it's of high quality. You've got aluminium, you've got the same steering wheel as found in the 992 911, so it's the smallest diameter one they do, and it's great because it's like you're sitting in a 911 but propped up higher. You've got the sports chrono gear selector over here. You've got the sports chrono watch as well, as is classic, and of course a very cluttered kind of center console, as was par of the course back in 2014 for Porsche. Yes, it's not got a digital screen, but I really like analog screens because they're like nice watches, and this reminds me of 991 911, and it's not a bad connection to make. The big difference is the 10-inch screen here rather than the old 7-inch one. You've got the latest operating system that Porsche offers, say in the Panamera and in the 992. Works really well. It's quite easy to click on the big tiles here rather than have smaller options like we used to have in the past. You also get Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, all done wirelessly rather than having to plug your wire in. And unlike, say, the Audis, you still get a physical toggle here in case you're driving and you don't want to mess around with the touchscreen, which is great. I also love the fact that you still have a large gear selector here, unlike the Porsche 992, which has got that tiny little key type thing. This I like, you can knock it into manual that way, etc. It's just really ergonomic, and I love the look of it and the position of it. The seats are flawless Porsche, as always, no complaints there. It's just a really great interior to be in. I love still the way that the air vents are designed. Yes, these ones are a bit lower now because the screen is larger, but they still work just as well, and they look fantastic with the aluminium trim within them. It really had some legs in it because it was really designed well in the first place. So no complaints on the interior. So I think we need to skip straight to the driving performance. Before that, it's important how a Porsche sounds when it starts up. So let's give it a start up in Sport Plus. So really a subdued sound experience from the Macan, but that's not what this car is all about, is it? It's all about defying physics. Whether we can get this 1.9 ton SUV to handle more like a sports sedan. And that's what we're going to find out now. The first ever truly sporty little SUV was this, the Macan. And I think we're going to chuck it straight into Sport Plus. Now, of course, we've got that new engine in this car, which we discussed earlier, 2.9 litre V6. You may have seen in the Audi RS4 as well, so it's a really nice engine, as we found in that car, but obviously very much different tune in this car for the Macan Turbo. Porsche leave no stone unturned when making something their own. Now, I really struggle with defining which category or which niche the Macan sits in, because we recently test drove the RSQ3 and the GLE43, and both of those cars are kind of competitors for this car, because the horsepower is quite similar, performance figures are quite similar, prices are quite similar, but both of those cars sit in different categories, whereas the Macan seems to slot in between, say, a GLC43 and a GLC63. So I feel that it kind of sits in its own niche almost. And I think that comes down to the fact that Porsche simply doesn't have a huge amount of niches like most manufacturers these days. They've got their large SUV and they've got their small SUV, and this is the smaller one. So it kind of makes sense if it fulfills more than one niche in its size. But that makes performance a bit of an oddity, doesn't it? Because you're battling, well, kind of no one, at least not properly. Now this V6 bi-turbo is something to shout about because it's got probably the best type of bi-turbo engine you can have, and that is one with a hot V setup, meaning that the turbos are nestled within the cylinder bank. So when you call for power, you haven't got the typical delay that you would associate with a turbo engine. Instead, it feels a lot more natural. So in real world terms, it's just a really nice engine to call power from, because you don't get delay. It feels really nice and natural. And now and then, you get some nice sound out of it as well. Sound is a real shame because of the OPF filter. It kills pops and bangs, as we know. Porsche have not put any kind of active sound like you might find in an A45 or a modern BMW. So everything you're getting is natural and it's very far away. So your pops and bangs are very much reduced compared to, say, the old Macan GTS, which sounded brilliant. Though to be fair, having owned the first generation Macan Turbo, When it first came out, there was no sports exhaust option for customers, and this sounds very similar to the car that I had. You can coax some sound out of it. I think the point is, because it's a V6, the tune is nice, but it just never really hits any kind of massive crescendo. Gearbox, as you expect, a PDK, is very responsive. I have found a bit of jerkiness between first and second gear. I didn't really find those aspects that crucial with this car as you might with others. What is so important about Macan is when you start driving it fast, how it kind of shrinks in size and feels more like a sports saloon than a tall SUV. And that is the magic, of course, of Porsche's handling know-how. The way the car shrinks. As soon as you start going fast, you point the nose into a corner and you put down the power. That trifecta of gearbox, engine and four-wheel drive system just never lets you down. But the way that the car hides its weight, and it's a heavy car, you know, it's 1.9 tons worth of SUV. It is super impressive in that regard. And really that is where you begin to have the fun. And it reminds me then of driving the 992 on this particular part of road. And that is when you begin to access the Porsche element, I feel, of this car. But you must really drive it quite hard to enjoy that. Otherwise, it's just such a refined vehicle, even in turbo form. One thing I absolutely adore about the steering, and I repeat myself in modern Porsche reviews, is how good the electronic rack that Porsche do in all of their cars is. It really gives you so much feeling, and I think they originally took so much flack for introducing it back with the 991. They were best placed to then make the best electronic steering racks in the market, and they have. No different here with the Macan Turbo. The dynamic engine mounts, the Porsche torque vectoring, everything comes into play and makes this turbo just handle like a little saloon. Perhaps even a hatchback, I don't know, it just seems to fulfill so many niches. It acts like a small fast hatchback, but you can raise your seat and drive in a more comfortable way. And suddenly it's more like a traditional SUV. So whenever I look at Porsche, it's kind of with rose-tinted glasses, because they've got fewer models that they're so passionate about, and they seem to fulfill so many niches. I must say, when the next Macan comes, and I hope the rumours are true that it won't only be electric, I shudder to think how good that car will be dynamically, given just how sweet the handling of this 1.9 ton original Macan, if you like, is. Now, comparing it to something like the Cayenne coupe turbo that we drove, that car is so much more theatrical in terms of the sound you get, in terms of the pure power you have as well. And I don't think in terms of handling, it's really that far behind. Porsche have done just an incredible job with the Cayenne coupe. And looking externally as well, when you look at cars like Stelvio Quadrifoglio GLC 63S, those cars have so much drama about them with regard to sound, and the handling is pretty bloody brilliant as well. The Macan sitting in its own niche, things become a little bit difficult for me looking at the Macan Turbo specifically. But if you look at the Macan S, which has so much going for it that this car already has, and there's not that much difference in feeling of speed or the handling aspect that the Turbo has, then as I felt in the past, the Macan S is really the sweet spot. Of course, that is for the majority of people. If we're talking for the petrol head, then you're going to want every element of the car to be as sharp as possible. And for those people, the Macan Turbo gives you that element of being the best Porsche that it can be. It's just a shame about the sound. What I've loved about living with this car is the refinement that it has. For me, there is no competition between cars like the RSQ3. They cannot match the Macan in terms of refinement and handling. And the more powerful SUVs in the mid-sector, they get bothered by this car's sheer dynamic ability as well, if not the power or the overall pleasure. Truly, for me, this car thus sits in a niche of its own, doing what it does best as a Porsche. And really, isn't that the essence of every Porsche since the beginning? To do things differently, but still do it brilliantly. So guys, I hope you enjoyed that full review of the new Macan Turbo. If you did, please do like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, support our very unique channel, and I'll see you again soon. Time to shoot off into the